Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. It is a great honor for me, both personally and professionally, to welcome you to the 2025 Holberg Conversation. Your more than 50 years of outstanding scholarship within the fields of literary studies, feminism, and anti-imperialist critique has served as an immense inspiration for my work, as it has for many, many others, both in the global north and in the global south. But first of all, let me extend my heartfelt congratulations to you on receiving the Holberg Prize for 2025, which you received, and here I quote from the Holberg Prize press release, for your groundbreaking interdisciplinary research in comparative literature, translation, postcolonial studies, political philosophy, and feminist theory, naming you one of the most influential global intellectuals of our time. It could not have been more deserved. I must admit that I have been waiting for this to happen for a long time. On the other hand, the timing could not have been better. Your lifelong dedication to promoting marginalized voices, particularly those of subaltern women, your ceaseless effort to make literary reading, indeed reading as such, important to facing the main challenges of a globalized world, your profound thinking about and setting to work of transformative pedagogies, both in the global north and in the global south, and your incessant call for social justice and democracy against globalizing finance capitalism and neo-imperialism speaks directly to the world we live in. Indeed, we find ourselves in troubled times. Right-wing political pressure and strong anti-gender sentiments threaten diversity, equality, and democracy alike. There is a pushback on women's rights and those of sexual minorities and trans people. There is an increased animosity against migrants. We're facing escalating economic differences on a global scale, privatization of common goods, land and sea grab, climate change, huge technological shifts, war and militarization, all of which your work helps to address and hopefully amend through slow and careful reading and work on the ground. We will come back to some of these issues in this talk, but first let us backtrack a bit. You earned a bachelor's in English from Presidency College in Calcutta before moving to the US to complete a PhD in comparative literature at Cornell University. As of today, you work or you teach at Columbia University as a university professor in the humanities. At the same time, you run 4 elementary schools in rural West Bengal, where you both teach children and offer teacher training. You also engage in other activist work, amongst them in West and East Africa. And you have, of course, written numerous influential books and groundbreaking articles. Your first claim to fame, if I might use such an expression, was your comprehensive introduction to and translation of grammatology by French philosopher Jacques Derrida in 1976. Later, what brought you into international attention from the late 70s onwards was your association with the emerging field of postcolonial studies. I know that you do not any longer consider yourself a postcolonial critic, but a post-Hegelian Europeanist. Indeed, you wrote a scathing critique of postcolonialism in your book, A Critique of Postcolonial Reason in 1999, where you point out that the production of postcolonial knowledge in the academies of the global north have become complicit in the dynamics of the financialization of the globe. Nevertheless, together with Edward Said and many others, your work in these years considerably changed how we think about imperialism, literature, and intellectual activism. Somewhat simplistically, we can describe these early interventions as theoretical investigations of the discursive practices underwriting colonialism and securing the uneven power relations between the global north and the global south today, economically, politically, technologically, scientifically, linguistically, and culturally. Of foremost interest, perhaps, is the production of a set of binaries such as us and them, developed and underdeveloped, civilized and uncivilized, the subject and object of scientific research, the helper and those in need of help. Binaries that uphold both violent and benevolent imperialism and fortify the interests of the colonizer. In this context, you criticized Western feminists and other radical Western intellectuals for being oblivious to their vested interests in imperialist logics. You argued quite forcefully that it should not be possible, and here I quote you, to read 19th century British literature without remembering that imperialism, understood as England's social mission, was a crucial part of the cultural representation of England to the English. Yet you did not want to discard of Western literary and philosophical tradition. Rather, you wanted to rework it from within, to make it relevant to global issues. You did so by carefully unlocking that which was excluded from these texts, their founding silences, often subaltern voices, as well as put the text into critical contact with other texts, other ways of thinking, and not the least with other subaltern languages. So I want to ask you, when looking back on those years, can you say something about how these early texts have influenced your thinking as such?
Kari, thank you for that excellent introduction, which describes someone who is really much more accomplished than I am. But it's good to begin on that footing. How does the early stuff still influence me? Is that your question?
Yes.
Right. I don't really know myself, because one of the things that I feel very strongly, it's that what I say about myself is really the least trustworthy stuff about me. What you say or what others say, that's what I listen to, so that I must be what others think I am. This is the basis of the way I began, even, to understand that my point of view is not necessarily the correct one. So if this has come from the early days, then that's how the early days influence me. As for the influence of Derrida, which is my first really public gesture, that remains with me because this business of autocritique, this also came from Marx. The autocritique, which makes for the most powerful practice, this stays with me, so that I would say that my self-description, which might be wrong, is that I learn from my mistakes, that you have to be able to, and here's the Hegel, to distinguish between the good mistakes and the bad mistakes, the productive contradictions and the non-productive ones. So this also, the post-colonial business, it just came, you were talking about the early days. Edward Said, who was really an ally and a close friend, he, myself, and then much later, Homi Bhabha, these are the three people and who are considered to be, but of course behind us are people like Chinua Achebe. I think of the voice coming from Africa as much stronger in the post-colonial, the diasporic post-colonial business. But before that, it's the people who actually fought for negotiated independence of the colonies. That was the post-colonial movement, not Edward and I, just because we were more effective in the United States. Edward told me when I met him in 1974, I felt that I was Orientalized. And coming to the United States, like most metropolitan migrants, I felt that, I was being robbed of my Indian identity. Those were the beginnings. And so after that, I began the autocritique that I was talking about. How did I suddenly, after I left India, begin to think of myself as post-colonial And why was it liked so much? That's where you have very correctly noticed that I became critical of what I was doing. So that's the way in which those early days, but the real early days are my parents. They were very unusual, plain living, high-thinking intellectuals. And they brought us up, the siblings, in a very feminist way, which was quite unusual in the 40s. And they brought us up to think of ourselves as capable of judgment, rather than obey them to test what they were asking us to do. That's the early influence that I don't think will ever leave me.
No, and I can detect a lot of your own kind of like teaching pedagogy in what your talk is saying about your parents.
That's
in
wonderful,
that sense.
because when someone asks me, how do I think of myself? I say, as a classroom teacher. And you recognize that. That's wonderful, because another person who was interviewing me about a month ago says this. It's very funny. Says, looking at your curriculum vitae, said this man, it would seem to me that you're an intellectual. So I said to him, why can't a teacher also be an intellectual? It's not a contradiction. So yes, I think the teaching habit, good or bad, I really got from my parents.
We'll come back to that, but I also want to linger a little bit on not maybe the earliest text, but talk a little bit about the influence from Derrida, but also the influence from Marx. That has also played a very important role in your thinking, and still do, I think, to a large extent.
Yes.
And I just wanted to kind of maybe take as a starting point your essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, which you have published in several versions, and also the part of a critique of postcolonial reason. But I just wanted to refer back to the epigraph of the first published version of Can the Subaltern Speak?, which is then your most famous essay, still maybe, although I do find the later work maybe even more invigorated right now, but we'll come back to that. But this is from 1988, and you state in the epigraph that an understanding of contemporary relations of power and the Western intellectuals' role within them requires an examination of the intersection of a theory of representation and the political economy of global capitalism. And I think this sentence is quite indicative of how you constantly seek to combine the material or the economic with language and the textual.
Influence of Marx.
Yes. Influence of Marx, because when you talk about representation, you also talk about Marx in that sense. So it's not like you talk about Marx and economics and representation, then you go to Derrida. It's Marx that is the grounding kind of voice here. But then you also come back, you put kind of Marx and Derrida in what you can find a kind of productive tension when you are addressing these questions. And it's a really complicated article, so we can't go into all of the nitty-gritties here. But you're theorizing here of the material and historical structures of imperialism, the epistemological assumptions of Western thought, and the violence is implicit in the act of representation, especially as it concerns the codification of Hindu law under British colonial rule. And you do so because you're taking this also. It's not simply like what you could say, like a negative critique or showing how these epistemic violences work, but you're also trying to suggest an alternative way of thinking, because the whole codification renders the voice of the subaltern woman inaudible. But what you want to shed light is then an effort to speak otherwise. from the position of the subaltern. And I was wondering if you could say something more about how Marx and Derrida informs these efforts of thinking otherwise. And I'm sure there's lots of Paul de Man in here too, like these allegories of reading. But I think also because Marx and Derrida has been important to you for so many years.
I have to tell you a story about my utterly brilliant mother. She read everything I wrote. So I sent her of grammatology, my translation, which has, as you know, a monograph-style introduction. I don't believe she read the Derrida part, but she read the introduction because I wrote it. And she told me, Gayatri, this has a relationship with Buddhist Shunyavada, which is quite correct. And this also relates, it seems to me, to our, meaning Indian, our Nagarjuna, a well-known philosopher. And she was correct. Those two similarities are very strong. And then she says to me, but dear, how are you, in Bengali, of course, how are you going to reconcile your communism with this? And so I told this story to Derrida. And Derrida gave me a smile and said, Gayatri, you should listen to your mother. So, I mean, this has been there right from the beginning, and to an extent. She told me what my project should be.
But you hadn't read Marx before that, or did you start reading Marx because of your mother's comment?
No, I did West Bengal, which is where I'm from. It's second international communism. It's, in fact, the Mexican Communist Party was founded by a Bengali. You know, it's my mother's brother was a member of the Legislative Assembly from the old Communist Party of India. So, in fact, it was an actually existing kind of intellectual Marxism within which, I mean, most intellectuals in Bengal in those days were, in fact, communists. So it was, my mother's brother, the MLA, he was the one who first gave me Capital Volume 1. I was 15. And he gave it to me and said, well, take a look at this. I was, of course, very precocious. It's already in college. But so that's where I actually, unlike the Western, by the way, this whole position that is perceived as against the West, one should think about it just slightly, because I'm also a Western Marxist and a Western feminist and a Western scholar. I've lived in the United States for 64 years, involved in teaching there. So to signify me as my very good friend Henry Louis Gates Jr. would say, to signify me as non-Western is already a diasporic mistake. So I should be recognized as what a Western Marxist perhaps should be self-critical about, rather than someone who's pointing a finger at the Western Marxists. I am one of them. But at any rate, at home, I was growing up within this kind of Marxist, communist, really, background. And then the encounter with Marx again was a very different kind of Marx. You know, it was, so the two together became something that slowly changed into a position of feeling that Marx is my brother, rather than someone who influences me. You see, that's the way I teach reading, that you read the theory as if it's creative writing, as if you're reading a new book, as if you can enter into the writing of the book, not as you, but as the person who wrote it. Then and you do not apply it. You read it for itself, so that it becomes so internalized that you don't recognize it when you read. So that I talk a little bit now about influence because people want to hear it. But I was never influenced by these people. I resonated with them. You know, later I recognized that this metaphor, this concept metaphor, was also used in ancient Indic theory, the idea of dhvani, pratidhvani, that's resonance. And it is also in the German classical philosophy that I like so much, Bestimmung, that's Stimme, that's being in tune with something, not the English translation determined. The English translation of Bestimmung is determination, economic determination. But in the German, and the person who allowed me to think this was Werner Hamacher. People would say, well, Gayatri, come on, what do you mean? Bestimmung is determination. You can't make it into tuning. Werner said, and really enabled me, he said, you really have brought out something which even teaches me something, the native German speaker. And I was, free to think of it. So to an extent, it's my idea of doing things under the influence of someone is way later to say something which perhaps in a more vulgar way resembles something that they had said. So I recognize, I'm tuned with them. You know what I mean?
I know, I know what you mean, but it's also a very difficult task, I guess. But like for something, like you grow up with something and then you are attuned from your upbringing, and then it's about attuning yourself to new thought later. I think I referred to you when I try to teach my students to read, but I don't know if you actually said this, but I think you did, that you have to say yes to the text at least 3 times before you can say no.
I'll tell you what I do say, that you have to learn to say yes to the enemy.
Yeah.
Not so much to the text. Yes, the text is always other, but to the enemy. Because if one thinks, and I'll go back to your initial question, if one thinks about war, and you very correctly said that it's good that although I do hesitate with that we are being recognized so late. Hortense Pillers and I, we're in our mid-80s, and we're only just being recognized because it's becoming more fashionable to recognize people of color. What happened over all those years? How come we were not recognized before?
I know.
You know what I mean? Hortense and I actually talked to each other about this. Look, it was only 2 years ago that Angela Davis, who's a little younger than we are, I mean, she was born in 46, we were born in 42. Angela Davis, Hortense, and I were given this American, the Academy of Arts and Sciences. Why so late? We're in our 80s. You know what I mean? What happened before? We've been working very hard all these years. Yeah. But at any rate, I mean, MacArthur Prize, I never got one. Why? It's when one looks at the people who did get them, there's nothing to be compared to the kind of activist work that Angela, even more than I, that Angela has done, that Hortense does, that I myself also do. Why didn't we ever get those? So yes, it is true, a time of war. But if you think about war, you win peace by killing more people. That's not peace.
I know.
Or by negotiated agreements, which will be broken. That's not peace. The real thing is to be able to change desires, to rearrange desires in the enemy. But you can't do that it's very slow, and without saying yes to the enemy. I will talk in my other presentations about gorgeous. People find in the sophists, the sophistical tradition now, something much stronger than the reasonableness of the Socratic. That is to say, to be able to argue the other side as if the other side is yours, saying yes to the enemy. The same thing in the Nyaya philosophy, in the Indic tradition. You cannot graduate into philosophy unless you're able to argue the pratipaksha, the other side, as if you are there. This is the hardest part of the imaginative activism that one teaches, saying yes to the enemy. And if I may just continue for a minute, see, when I talked about being of resonating with, I was not talking about trying to resonate, changing what I was. Those things happen without your attempting to do this. The resonance you recognize afterwards, and it's a surprise. Wittgenstein would say that, you have to, the reason why Vorstellungen, that is to say, thinking about something conceptually in a rough and ready way so that you can start to think, they never really teach you anything. Because, he says, they never surprise you because you thought it like you planned, okay, I must change. You thought it through already. So, and he says, therefore, you never say to a Vorstellung, siehe da. This is such a beautiful way of putting it. So what you have to recognize is that I didn't make an attempt to undo the earlier. No, I didn't recognize any of that. I was just trying, I was just thinking in my own way. And later, I was surprised to see that I was resonating with stuff that I had read before. It's always, as Aristotle would say, it's a touche, it's a surprise. It's not something that you plan. See, this is an important thing. You plan something else.
But isn't it also true that you have to put yourself in that kind of position or relationship to the text or the other that can make this resonance possible? You don't know where you're going, but if you just start out by being like super critical and stuff like that, that resonance might not happen.
See, the way I teach, I try to say to my students, see if you can undo yourself rather than preparing yourself to do this and that. Just see if you can suspend yourself. It's very hard, but it's that prayer to be haunted by. See, haunting, to be haunted, it's unanticipatable. You can only try to be haunted by it. And it's also non-periodic. It's not like every third page I'm being haunted. No, you may never be, because there's too much of you in this attempt. So it's really trying not to attempt anything that I try to teach as the secret of reading. It's because if you attempt something, it's still you. And the thing is, you're still reducing the text to the black box in your head. This is why the humanities are a practice of learning rather than a production of knowledge. And so it's a hard thing.
Yeah.
And I haven't perhaps learned it myself yet. But it's worth trying. And I say, you won't be able to do it right now, because you won't learn the piano, again, Wittgenstein, in one lesson. But on the other hand, you have to begin, and the learning to play the piano will come much later. But in learning to read, that's the first step. Undo yourself. See if you can really, and that is also very hard because you're trying to resist your own attempt to relate to the text, because this is what the superpower children, my Columbia students, are taught to control the text, to produce close readings. That's like cross-examining the text. No, to surrender. It's very hard, but that's really what I try to teach.
You place a lot of hope maybe in reading, and also pointing out how it has a lot of political effects and ethical effects. In fact, in a way, it's reading that is your entry point into a lot of the pressing issues that we are facing today. And I know that you invoke Derrida's kind of claim for, or saying that we need slow reading in times of urgency, which is kind of like a little bit paradoxical, because people say, no, we have to do stuff, that we don't have time for this kind of like thinking. But your entry point is into this kind of like slow epistemic change that are needed for real change. And I think maybe there's a little bit of Marx here too, or your critique of Marx is like his humanistic streak, that he was thinking like you need class consciousness and then you will have a revolution and then you can create a better society. But you point out that people aren't epistemically fit for creating changes that can stick. And that is why reading is so important. Am I right in claiming that?
I think, as I said before, when you say this so clearly, so understandably, I feel I must be this. You know what I mean? That's the way I move. That's the way, it's what the smart, sympathetic people even who love my text, well, and people who hate my text. The Alexander Cruz, who's a friend of mine from the Philippines, he told me once that he was teaching me, and one of the young men in the class said, slapping his thigh, "I hate Spivak." And I love that, because, it's to be able to produce in a straight young man who wants to be a leader that kind of hatred. I have moved him. You know what I mean? So to an extent, I always take from the reader what they say I'm doing, and I tell myself, I must be doing that. Otherwise, it's not possible for someone to have felt it. And so, yes, but let me say that in my critique of Marx, Marx was an extremely smart man, so that my critique is not something that is necessarily correct. But what I have said is that he had a humanist has too much confidence in human beings. He certainly wanted to make a mindset change in the worker, an epistemic change, which Gramsci recognized. The worker must not think of himself or even herself, that's there in Marx, must not think of himself or herself as a victim, but rather as the agent of production. Marx never really talks about revolution. The only revolution that he really describes is the one that he saw, and it was a failure. And in the 18 Brumaire, he talks about the content of the revolution. And what is the content of the revolution? The content of the proletarian revolution of the 19th century is, and he meant every word, the poetry of the future. I quote, people don't understand what, and they're also right at the end there, that paragraph, that, the situation creates an imperative, and what? Hier ist die Hose, hier tanze, dance, and poetry. Why does he say when he talks about revolution? Because that violent revolution was not, it happened because of the way the world was. That was not, in fact, Marx and Engels' suggestion. In fact, in the 1872 introduction to the Communist Manifesto, which was the last edition that they introduced, they said, and it's available everywhere, it's not just in the library, it's there in the English translations, people pay no attention. They said, ignore all the sections about the revolution in the Communist Manifesto, because in the last 25 years, from 1847 to 1872, in the last 25 years, big business has gone too far so that none of the things we said about the revolution apply anymore. They say it is, that stuff is veraltet. It's grown old, it's gone. Don't pay any attention to it. We have kept it exactly as it was because it's become historically iconic. So, I mean, but no one pays any attention to this. They're still following the Communist Manifesto. So, to an extent, the idea, but Marx had too much confidence in the human being because he thought that if, after reading all of that, the working class does change and then they own the means of production, then the surplus value that is produced, they will have a socialist viewpoint. They will just keep what they need and use the rest to build a just society. He didn't recognize that people have to be changed, that the human affects are greed, fear, and violence. This Paulo Freire says, for example, that if there's no pedagogy of the oppressed want to become sub-oppressors. This is the thing that Marx was just too trusting in humanity to know, that socialism will not come automatically if they own the means of production. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's really the critique that I humbly offer as a teacher of the humanities, because I even say that real humanities teaching dehumanizes, because the human is fear, greed, and violence. Greed first. Even when the mother says, my child, it's a very benevolent form of greed. So greed is very basic. Self-preservation is greed. So this is what has to be: greed, fear, and violence. That's what we deal with. And if I may add another little piece here, part of this also came from the Vietnam War. I was teaching already, right? I was an assistant prof. And the GI Bill, the veterans from the Vietnam War came to our classes. People who were destroyed by having killed. You know, most of them were aphasic. This is the 50th year from the Vietnam War. Most of them couldn't write. And I had a student we had many students like that, and we were supposed to be changing them. Imagine the task. And so this guy, Bruce, he couldn't speak, he couldn't write. How on earth he changed, I don't know. But he did change. He was my greatest success, right? And right at the end, before he left, he gave me a photograph, beautiful lyrical photograph of two grasshoppers copulating. Because he said, I have no faith in human beings anymore, but you have restored me. So to an extent, you know, that kind of stuff, not to have faith in human beings, but to change, to rearrange desires. That's the hardest part of what I have learned through, and because that was early days, the Vietnam War veterans. You were asking me about early days.
I'm asking about early days, but I want to follow up on that a little bit, because I sense that this idea of the human as greedy is something that has become more outspoken in your later work. And I remember also some of your earlier texts, you talk about to be human is to be directed towards the other. And I was wondering if this is the effect of a change that you are seeing in the world today, that we are becoming more greedy, or if this is just kind of like two. You can talk about like the human as poison and medicine in a way, that they are two kind of interlocking things about human beings, and that we have to kind of move away from the other, and if that has been part of your thinking all the time, or if your thinking about human being actually have changed with everything that's happening.
I think a bit of both, actually, a bit of both. I mean, the fact of telling my students that when they want a job and they want me to write a recommendation letter pointing out that they are better than all the rest, that is already a moment of emphasizing competitiveness, which is greed. So it's not, greed makes us, we can never be fully non-greedy. It allows us to be alive. You have to be able to restrain greed, transform greed, all that stuff. So I said that from very early on. And I was doing this from very early on, but slowly, it certainly with the corporatization of the universities, with the possibility of digital capitalism, all of that stuff, it became clearer and clearer that human greed was able to manifest itself. And also, you live in the United States, the constant ignoring of subalternization required by capital and the constant emphasizing of what good capital can do. I mean, Marx himself said capital can do good. Nobody is going to deny that. But also what is actually incumbent upon the doing good. This is constantly denied in the US and elsewhere, in India too today. India has become a very greedy kind of place. So, and postcolonial nations have become that way. So to an extent, yes, one noticed it more and more. And now, of course, you cannot not notice it. Now, in fact, in order to stay alive, you have to censor yourself, which is why I was objecting so strongly to being censored. And, I have refused to do TED Talks because they are so censoring. They tell you everything, how you ought to be speaking, how you ought to be moving. And I finally said to them, I'm not going to be able to do this. So in order to be able to talk, you're going to tell me everything. So even the sort of innocent censoring that was done in terms of this particular conversation, hide your cane, don't drink while you're talking, your skirt is too short. I was really coming forward because this is actually a replica of the world we're living in. We have to censor ourselves in order to remain teaching. My university gave in for that particular reason, right? It gave in. And so this is true then in both ways, that it was already there, but at the same time, I also began to recognize it more as, and Etienne Balibar, whom I adore, you see, Hortense, Etienne, and I are of the same age. I'm February, Hortense is March, Etienne is April. 1942 was a good year. And so it was also the year of Britannia. Okay, but at any rate, so Etienne, who certainly knows more Marx than I do, he says that Marx cannot be followed, and then he uses a word from the European translation of Mao, because he rectifies him, that's the word, he rectifies himself constantly. I, on the other hand, say that's why he can be followed, because he learns from his mistakes. You see, so this is the thing. This is the change that you so nicely described. So yes, it was there. And at home now, I lecture a lot in Bengali. I publish, I teach, etc. in Bengali. At home, when I'm asked to lecture, I'm very critical of the mechanical Marxists because, they came into power. For 34 years, I was living within an already existing socialism, which is not Etienne, which is not the Western Marxists, not Frederick Jameson. See, there was that experience, which is also something which allows me to be very strongly and publicly critical of large audiences of mechanical Marxists. So
yes, and you do talk beautiful about that in your article, Global Marx, which I needed help to unpack from a friend who spends a lot of times in India and is a specialist on, because there you get the sense of this kind of communist party that have adapted to a certain way of thinking about the electorate and are not really critical of what's going on. Is that
yes,
correct? Yeah.
again, this is something that I can agree with you because my real influence, a word that I generally am very careful about, but this one is through conversation, so I can describe it, is from a Bengali intellectual in the 70s, Shamar Sen, who, what he taught me was left of the left critique of the parliamentary left, because the parliamentary left was West Bengal and the center was not socialist, right? So therefore the parliamentary left had to compromise constantly and more or less give up. So that's why I've never been member of any kind of party. So because that's where I have a recognizable bit of being influence, those discussions in the 70s about how, in fact, one ought not to give in to what used to be called the mischief of the party spirit. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. But to just follow up on the current situation, which we started off on early, and of course it's really difficult to access or assess what you are going to do in this situation. But you do, I have heard you say a couple of times that you wish we had spent as much money on education as we do on defense.
this is recent.
Yeah.
This is recent. I mean, because I'm not someone who really offers structural solutions because of the future anterior. What will have happened is not what we plan. But on the other hand, the short term, not just the slow change, but the short term stuff we have to do constantly. And I'm now in a position that I'm constantly asked for these solutions. And I must be able to say something. Yes to the enemy in the sense of total confidence in structural change. People will say, I have changed the lives of 62 million. I'm actually quoting someone, a wonderful person, 62 million girl students. And I said, no, you haven't, because you're not involved in the quality of the education. You've given buildings, you've given textbooks, you've paid teachers, but you take good teaching for granted, like Marx taking the working classes' good instinct to go into socialism for granted. Nothing happens. So to an extent, the short-term solutions also have to be given knowing that it won't work. But since I'm asked, I must have a solution. And the solution for me is to take advantage of the alternative, the social movement structure, the international civil society structure, which is very active, which has been since at least 1994, when in Cairo, the United Nations actually had an NGO forum. Before that, of course, the United Nations governments had nothing to do with the non-governmental organizations. But 1994, the United Nations joined them. And since then, this alternative civil society structure, which today is very often, except for the People's Alliance, reliant on corporate funding, but nonetheless, the structure exists. And so I've said, use that structure and try to make people think, change their desires into thinking the importance of this. As I said, it's more important than spending money on defense, because to go back there, that does not produce real peace. People are always surprised. Oh, it was broken. That, the war to end all wars, the Second World War, it was broken. We are almost, first we had the Cold War, then we are almost in the Third World War. What is this? Well, if they had been reasonable, they would have known that you don't earn peace by destroying Germany, let's say. No, you don't kill people and then say this is peace. No. So to an extent, we are saying yes to the enemy now. How much there is in the world of the neo-Nazi movements, so that that's, going back. So to an extent, if they've only realized that that is not smart, that kind of Defense Department type searching for peace is wrong, then they would perhaps spend as much money on this kind of project of non-stop teacher training, decentralized, paying attention to the world's wealth of languages, because they don't even know how people think peace within the languages that they don't know anything about. So to impose your idea of peace in English, or to impose your idea of peace in French, German, Russian, Arabic, Chinese, no. You have to see that the world's population, the largest sectors of the electorate, they think in other languages. So then they would think that if we really want to combat war, we ought to spend at least as much money on this as on defense. This is practical. So this is what I say. It'll never happen. But on the other hand, if they're asking me for advice, and I don't like giving this kind of advice, this is the best I can do.
You talk about like transnational literacy, especially in your Death of a Discipline, where you're trying to rework how comparative literature can work, and also how the humanities can work to supplement the social sciences and the natural sciences. Can you say something more about the transnational literacy, what you mean by that?
That's why I would say this to humanists, that they're so naive, they're ignorant of everything else, right? So this idea of knowing what's happening in the world, that's the humanities person is never going to become an expert in transnationality. I was talking about literacy there. Literacy is the lowest level of knowledge, right? Just literacy and numeracy. Up to that point, one should know what the transnational world is. But I've changed it some because it's supposedly we live in a post-national world because of the globalization of the world. And as I have said in my next to the last book, The Aesthetic Education, it's only capital and data globalize because they're digital. Everything else is damage control. And so now, of course, there is also artificial intelligence which can globalize. So, but that was not there when I was writing that book. So we are doing damage control for the three things that globalize. Because you brought up medicine and poison, because they're also medicine. They're not just poison. But in order for them to become medicine, you have to know the dosage. And knowing the dosage is that slow training, right? So to that extent, the idea of globalization has changed transnational literacy, because we now have to see how it is also post-national, and therefore how a demand is being made for fierce identity politics, because people will not recognize, so it's a slightly critical moment, Kari. I will say that the word global south and global north, in fact, are through that ideological position, because that allows you to ignore the south in the north, the subaltern migrants who are getting destroyed and drowned and sent to Libya. And it also allows you to ignore the north in the south, the dollar, and as you know, we call them dipsos in India, dollar income private sector. So this, and to an extent, I belong to that, don't I? Dollar income, private sector volunteer, that's me. So to an extent, you have to be aware that you're also, I say to my students, so there's a kind of global criticality, questioning identity, etc., which is now slightly different from just transnational literacy. I say to my students in the villages, I am your enemy. You see, I'm an atheist, but I was born a caste Hindu. So, to an extent, for thousands, colonialism was just yesterday, 300, 400 years. But thousands of years we've practiced the caste system. And it is I'm okay. My parents were totally anti-castists. They were okay. But 2 generations in the face of 5,000 years is nothing. So you must do without me. I'm your enemy. So to an extent, the idea of the global South and the global North does not exist because I'm supposedly global South. I carry an Indian passport, but I'm the North and the South. Even in New York, you asked me where I lived. I live in Washington Heights, which until day before yesterday was North Harlem. But I'm part of the gentrification in New York City. So therefore, I have to recognize, I pay income tax in the United States. I have to recognize that it's all tied up together. Otherwise, you're not effective. You know what I mean? So that's where transnational literacy has to be somewhat changed, transformed into this global criticality, because otherwise you will recognize this and laugh with me, I know. What happens is we go to these global conferences, okay, and they've got one person from every area, and that person is generally English department, or if it's Morocco, French department, etc. They're not people who have chosen to study the non-profitable, the ancient culture in their home areas. I mean, I'm a Europeanist, I'm an English department person. So to an extent, they don't know anything really about the depths of whatever culture they're from. But so they will hear something and they will say, oh yes, in my culture too, there's some, they don't know anything. So therefore, global criticality, earning the right not to start those idiotic in my culture too things, that's also something very necessary right now, because we who are in the old imperial language departments are the ones who are globally circulating as representatives of the so-called global South. And this is how we comport ourselves. So that's transnational literacy was just literacy in how the nations are economically and politically relating to each other. But now it's changed into this global criticality because of the globalization business. One of my students told me, just as I was packing and she made me late, she called me and said, by the way, I read in the New Yorker a piece by someone who teaches at Princeton. He's discussing AI, artificial intelligence, and he chooses you as the representative of the humanities, as someone whom AI cannot reproduce. It's a wonderful compliment. I don't even know. I don't even know this person at Princeton. But you see, this person has recognized something which I probably don't deserve, but nonetheless recognized at least what I would like to think. So this is damage control, you know.
But talking about AI, because I know I shouldn't be so scared and critical of technology, but I think the whole idea of integrating AI into the teaching system is really dangerous, because what you will have students do is to just put a text through AI and ask it to give you kind of like the main points of an argument. And then you never learn to read if that's how you're...
It is true that, of course, there is no such thing as a natural intelligence. Our own computer in the head is also artificial. That's something that we ought to keep in mind. But it is true that my doctor, for example, AI is good for medicine. AI is good for all different kinds of. It's good for art because art can take anything. But it's my doctor says to me the last time I saw him, it was 2 or 3 days ago. He says, let's talk slowly because AI now does my thinking for me, and I was fine, okay. And then he sent me his report. And at last, what I noticed is his real kind of contempt for me. Whereas before, he wrote it himself very nicely. But now AI has picked it up. You see, so what AI has produced from his conversation with me shows that, he really thinks of me as, a fat person. He thinks of me as someone who eats too much. He thinks of me as, and he's, it has, because it is dumb. It's just, AI has just caught what is in there. And I was laughing and laughing, and he thinks of me as also, losing my intelligence. It's just amazing, the way he describes this person, this patient. So to an extent, there is that. But it is, of course, true that one ought not to think of AI as solving all of the slow thinking processes. One must keep, as we used to say about the digital, AI on tap rather than on top. So, this is something that we have to, I agree with you, and most people will agree with you. I mean, the persons who are actually at the top of the AI philosophical thinking, they are quite afraid. It is not just you and I. So we ought to let that fear guide us in teaching people to manage an artificial intelligence which will become much more, much faster, much more quantum than we can ever be. But we have to manage it because there is, at least now, still a human element in the supplying of the. That's why I gave my doctor's example. And so it just seems to me that the fear will perhaps produce something, although we can't really plan for it because something else will have happened.
I want to kind of back, we have been talking about this, but I think like teaching is so important that not the least in relationship to AI, but also in relationship to epistemic changes and the violence and the greed and everything that's going on. So I want to kind of talk a little bit more about it. And I know that you have always been writing about teaching in a certain way because a lot of your text starts in the classroom. Classroom is a place where things happen, but you have also written particularly about teaching. And a very, very recent essay that you published, Teaching for a Broken World, is some kind of like sums up a lot of the challenges that we are facing. And I would just like to quote shortly where from that essay, where you point out precisely, as you also said here, that the humanities teach the practice of learning, and that in the humanities classroom, we teach how to learn from the singular and the unverifiable. And then you continue, this is a difficult thing to learn and teach. We have an extraordinarily difficult task of teaching the practice of learning, the practice indeed of freedom, which is very different from just the production of knowledge. And that leads me to kind of like more concrete questions. Like, firstly, how do you do this? Can you give us some practical examples of how you go about this teaching? And secondly, what I also find especially compelling is that you teach in so profoundly different contexts. The elite University of Columbia in New York and elementary schools in rural West Bengal. And your experiences in these vastly different places must offer some sharp insights, I think, into the challenges and possibilities of teaching across global inequalities. So I was wondering if you could reflect on that difference and what this difference had perhaps also taught you about the practice and ethics of education.
You know, this is really a very hard question because I don't know what I do in the classroom. You know, it's for the Columbia students, I always have them write a page on relating to the text that we are going to read the next day. And they have to, and just no more than one page. They have to be able to do it Times New Roman, 12 point, 1-inch margin all around, one page. I won't read more than that. And so, but relating to the text, not summarizing. So just relating to a page of the text. And they have to give it in by midnight. And so can you imagine that I prepare my class from those responses, just correcting those responses, you know, in a very, very natural kind of way, rather than go through all those philosophical things that you just described, because you can't talk at students and teach them anything. It doesn't work. So I point out, and this is, I've learned from these responses, that now as the university corporatizes more and more, the humanities are trivialized even within humanities departments, so that the digital humanities, rather than being on tap, rather than on top, become models in many ways that are totally useless. I show to the students, because of how they've written, that they're taught to control, to summarize, to have a topic idea, which then they make the text prove. In other words, reduction to their heads, and to bring in historical connections. You know, so in fact, they are not taught to read at all. That is to say, surrendering oneself to the text, saying yes to the text as enemy, even as other rather than me. This is, so I have to construct each class very fast from these responses.
And you teach a class a day after they hand it in by midnight.
The next day, yes. So therefore, it's so that I don't philosophize like that and my ideas, etc., because they are so far from those ideas that they will say, oh yes, we're doing it. And actually, I haven't yet learned how to do it, number one. Number two, it has to be done every generation, because every generation is born greedy, violent, and fearful. And so, you know, it's not something that you can so easily impart that, you know, teaching has changed. No, it doesn't. So to an extent, that's Columbia, right? And so when I go to the villages, to an extent, although they can't control anyone, I show them that they are also the largest sector of the electorate. So this is not Columbia. In fact, at Columbia, I have to tell them that they're not representative of the largest sector of the world, which still believes bribe culture and rape culture is normal, but living in this completely unrepresentative little world of, you know, a kind of mechanical feminism, choice of word anti-racism. So you don't say nigger, you say the N-word, right? So what difference does it finally make when outside in the world no change has taken place? So in fact, my students would fault me because I used the N-word in the previous sentence. But have they changed their minds? So to an extent, this is different in the villages. And so I tell them that, and not only do I tell them, I tell also their guardians when they come to eat on the last day, because we always have a feast the last day, that it's so much better in Bengali, but I will translate, because you see, in English you say intellectual labor and manual labor, hard phrases, whereas in Bengali you say making the head work or making the body work. Matha katano, gata katano. Very, very different from these English translations. But what I tell them is that the rich, big people, Borolok, the rich make their heads work, and you, the poor, are made to make your bodies work. And that's the difference which makes us just count votes. Counting votes is not a good society. I use words that are completely accessible. So you are actually just numbers. They don't think, the ones who win don't think of you as human beings who make the head work. They try to keep you just obeying and bamboozling you with holographs and so on, so that you think they're divine. And so you can be counted, and you are voting for tyrants. So this is because they all vote. You will see, if you come to my main talk, that I have a lot of little video clips. Right at the end, I was giving a talk on democracy. The two, I show them that they can teach something to the top. So I was asked at NYU for a little conference on democracy. And so I said to my people in the villages, I'm going to talk about democracy there in New York. Send me something. So they sent me 2 little clips. They sent me some other stuff too, which I don't want to waste your time, but they had sent me at least 2 little clips. One is a woman, the other is a man. And the woman is like old as old can be, okay, totally decrepit. And my female teacher is asking, it's subtitled for you folks, asking, imagine, they sent me this, asking this old woman, what's your name? So she gives the name. Do you cast your vote? Yes. Okay, so this is that lowest sector. And then the male teacher goes to a man. Okay, what's your name? Is it name? Do you cast your vote? Yes. Do you know what the vote is? No. I just give the vote because they're making a distinction between the male and the female. I give the vote because I cast my vote, because everybody casts their vote. I cast my vote, then I go home. I don't know. So you see, they sent me this to show to the New Yorkers so that they would understand that in order for the vote to be meaningful, you have to teach the difference between right and wrong. That's a very long process. So the two sides actually mingle. And this climate change business, they're always shown as victims. But I want them to feel that they're also responsible on their small scale. They're responsible for all the plastic that they throw away, and all of that stuff. And so I find a way of teaching them about the world. And I can't really go into it, but I will talk about it in my main speech, and so that they feel the cartography of the whole world as something real, And they said to me at one point, sister, let's teach this one to the whole village, not just to the classes and to us. And I didn't understand their request. I thought, there's no way that I can teach it to the whole village. And I just sort of concocted something. But I realized what they were saying was that this awareness of the cartography of the world and their responsibility to keep the world moving, etc., should be learned also by the villagers, not just the students, which is a fantastic kind of positive reinforcement, right? So, the two sides kind of mingle with each other, because I'm not interested in giving them top-down philanthropy. These human rights people come in, but after all, these subjects were not developed in the French 18th century, because that's the human rights subject, the end of the French 18th century, what Rosa Luxemburg or Marx would call bürgerliche Gesellschaft, citizenly society, whereas it's been translated into bourgeois, and bourgeois, that word carries all kinds of negative implications in English or French, but bürgerlich is citizenly, right? And these people, the subalterns in India or in other parts of the world, they've never entered into citizenship. They vote these days, but none of they are not made to feel inside citizenship. So therefore, when they come in, the human rights people, because actually, of course, there is no inalienable rights. That's a wonderful positive fiction, and fiction is strong. I mean, I've given my whole life to fiction. So that's a positive fiction devised by the French 18th century. And so these people, they have no understanding. They feel that those human rights folks are also like the top-down philanthropists, okay? It's okay. They sometimes do good, and sometimes they don't, because, like in Africa, clean water. Now, if you just come and give them clean water and buzz off, then in some places, they walk a great deal in poor African villages. And that's not you and I. You and I would not, unless we were specially trained walkers, we wouldn't walk like that every day. They balance things on their head. You and I would not be able to do this. So at the end of the day, all the women together, with these things balanced on their heads, walking together, it's a way of spending time together to get water. And water seems clean. Nobody teaches them why that water is unclean. So what it looks like is taking away this nice, relaxing time together for the women, because what the do-gooders see is that they're walking 6 miles, nothing if you really can walk. So the women going together, laughing and joking with the huge things on their head, getting water and coming back, it's a way of spending time together. So in order for the desire to change and for them to want clean water, so if you go afterwards with a native speaker and you pretend, since you don't know the language, I pretend to be just an old lady, I mean, wearing torn blue jeans and this and that, and on the back of a motorbike, so that no one even notices I'm there, Why did I come with? Maybe I need a ride. So I just sit on the floor in the corner of the room, and the person who knows the African language speaks. And the moment because if you record, you look like those human rights folks. So no recording. The moment he's finished, we rush to some local lodging place, and I immediately say, okay, tell me what you heard. and I write down. And the real thing is they don't feel they own these changes. Because, toilets, the idea of defecating together under the sun and talking, etc., this is a much more pleasant thing that you and I can't imagine. There's no way I can imagine this. But then to put you in a little room stinks. I mean, those government latrines. Why is this better? Again, taking away something. You must be able to imagine at least the pleasure taken in doing this together. So it's the idea of changing their desires so that they know why to want a latrine rather than. And so to my villages, I will say, and they will say, there's all this stuff under the trees, and says, see, this is our free latrine. So I would say to them, when cholera hits, and I will say, you see this, because the people who come from the government, they can't talk to them. They say oral fecal. I mean, why would they be convinced? And I said, look, you see those flies, and you see your free latrine there. Why don't I get cholera? Because first of all, I don't go under trees. And second of all, I will never eat anything where a fly sits. So I'm living with you here, and there are 23 cases of cholera in this village. I'm not getting it. And what you are having to do is you're having to take your mother on the back of your motorbike so that she can be given saline, and she may die. Why? Because of your free letterings. When you speak to them in this way, then you actually are in their understanding that it's okay to wash dishes from the same little area of water where you vomit because you have to clean yourself, etc., etc. You attempt to relate to that in terms of their own convictions with these kinds of examples, etc. So then these human rights changes become real, and not some positive fiction, underived fiction, unverifiable fiction. All fiction is unverifiable. Of inalienable rights, no. In the planetarity, one recognizes that there is no inalienable rights for human beings. No, human beings don't matter within planetarity. Absolutely no connection. So therefore, it's because within planetarity, an extinct Earth can operate perfectly systemically, no problem. It matters to the human beings because they will die. So that's something that one has to recognize in terms of the connection between the two places, because the subalternized places, not just subaltern, but subalternized by the very globalized capital that's allowing my Columbia students to live their really political lives, right? So when you can bring the two together by being frank with both sides rather than nice to the subaltern side and critical to the elite side, that's a mistake. You being nice to both sides, saying yes to both sides, then the two sides come together.
Do they ever meet? Do you
No, of course not.
No, because you don't arrange any meeting between
Are you joking? I would destroy both sides.
Yeah. So how? But for you then to learn from below and from the subaltern, it's mainly through language learning and reading. Then you don't want people to travel around and do.
No, I mean, but they wouldn't learn. They wouldn't learn. You don't learn so easily. I mean, I live with them.
Yeah.
I get into the texture. It's not possible to bring a US person to live with them. Even Indian people can't live with them. They will say, they will see me in the train station. Professor Spivak, really want to help you. So, okay, you can come one time and let's see if you can. I got my assistant that way. And so they come, but they're so afraid. They're just from a city, right? They're talking because of the way I live. I live with them, right? So they're talking to their mother nonstop, saying, no, it's okay. And then in the morning, they're weeping and they're saying, my father has just had a heart attack, I must go. It's not really so easy to really texture yourself into that way of living. So therefore, for the NGOs, you have to build separate places where they live. It's not that way that you create that distance, and you're not going to be able to do that kind of texturized work. So if it were possible, I would do it. There was one white Englishman student who read that piece that you just read in order to read. When you were introducing me, in order to study Europe, you have to, etc. So he learned Bengali. He learned it well. And, but he started publishing books. He was a very nice man. I took him to the villages that you were saying. And he learned to be without toilet paper and so on and so forth. But he began writing books where he would describe the method, so on, of how to teach subalterns. Whereas we would have debriefing discussions after each time, and I would say, remember, don't write about this for academic transcoding. We don't know what we're doing. So and I say to my teachers there, you can't really imitate me because intellectual labor can't be imitated. You know, that's in the Bengali, it's more literally correct what I'm saying. So because when I'm in the class, I'm trying to think how I can make the student work his or her head while, you know, there's a problem. And so something comes. Then if you imitate that the next time, it's no longer you're not making your head work. But so that's why I would say to this guy, remember, don't write about this method because we have no method. But I mean, to the point where extent that I described it to you right now, I didn't even talk like this 10 years ago. And now there is a little bit more confidence, and also I'm closer to death. So I do say this. And you know, the Columbia University Press asks me to write a thing for him, blurb, and I look at the manuscripts and my God, he's doing exactly what I asked him not to do. He couldn't stop. He's transcoding, you know, like, you know, if you think I tell my students to do this and that, like that. So I said to him, I can't take you anymore because now I feel like I'm your fieldwork and I can't train you if I'm feeling that I'm your fieldwork. You put yourself in a bad place. So he now avoids me completely for the last 5 or 6 years. You know, he wept, I wept, etc. But I haven't seen him for 5 years. If I come to the university where he teaches, if I come there, he finds a way of not being there. You see, so you can't take people just there and create special. There's no place to live for anyone there. You know, I mean, I live with them. So,
and then you also train teachers to teach.
I give time and skill, not just money, yes. I don't go there to observe.
No.
And I would also have to speak to the people who come in a language they don't understand, English. So then the distance would be created. This is a much more demanding work than just a project to help minorities. No, it's a much more. It's undoing centuries of very bad behavior on our part. You don't undo it by taking others to go and observe. They become objects. So no, they have to learn through imaginative activism rather than immediately going and making them objects of. They wouldn't learn anything. They wouldn't learn anything. So that's the problem. And maybe if one began taking it more seriously, the defense, and began producing that huge international civil society model project of the sort that we discussed right at the beginning, maybe that will change. But I can't promise because of the future anterior. Whatever one plans, something else happens. So therefore, you just do it for the philosophers of the future. Poetry of the future, Marx.
Yes, and I wanted to ask you about that. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about feminism. I see that the time is running. But you chose as a topic for your Holberg speech the imperative to reimagine the future. And of course, that also brings a lot of associations to previous work. The imperative to reimagine the planet. It's a talk that you gave like in Germany in
1997.
1997.
In Switzerland.
Yes, in Switzerland. I'm sorry. Where you also talk about like planetarity that you just mentioned.
I just thought of it for the first time.
Yeah.
In 1997.
Yes. And then of course it's also this future, and you talk a lot about the future anterior in Death of a Discipline, for example, which can kind of like describe like an imaginative flight into the future, and then trying to recount what would have needed to have happened in order to get there, like an imagination without any guarantees, really. And I was wondering if you could say something about how these two imperatives connect.
And they really correct rather than connect. So change the ends to R's. It seems to me that an imperative comes from the outside. And, I spoke in China, and this has not been made public, in Yunnan, about the imperative to rethink, to reimagine the Silk Road. And because I wanted to take up the One Belt, One Road project that China has taken up. And I could see that it was a transformation in their minds of the Silk Road, which was, after all, a huge thing that China undertook, at the time of Buddhism. That's a long time, and really achieved a great deal. And I saw that in the United States, for example, the Marshall Plan was made into a wonderful thing. Whereas if you looked at it from the point of view of Europe, first of all, it didn't always do good. I mean, for example, in Sardinia, David Rockefeller undid malaria by giving tons and tons and tons of DDT, which was a very bad killer, right? And that was part of the Marshall Plan. One never thinks about those kinds of things. So I wanted to be able to imagine an enemy, because being an Indian, living in the United States, China is always shown to be intrinsically corrupt. So, so I wanted to say yes to the Chinese and reimagine the Silk Road. And so there I said that imperatives always come from the outside. It's not something that you want to do, but you're made to do something. And so, once again, that passage in Marx that I quote all the time, the only passage where he describes the content of a revolution, whereas otherwise it's all form, the value form. So in the content, he says that things happen in such a way that finally in the proletariat hears hic rodus, hic salta. This is roads, jump here. Because the proletariat had made the false promise that it could jump over the blank in Rhodes, where the Colossus of Rhodes stands. And of course, it was a false promise. No human being can jump that far. And so the proletariat is told, hic Rhodus, this is Rhodes, jump here. And then Marx mistranslates, here is the rose, because Rhodus also means rose in Greek, and dance here dance, and imitating Hegel and changing. So imperatives are like that. The imperative will say, here is the rose, dance here, rather than keep talking, keep talking, keep talking. And so what happened in 1997 was I was told to change, to make the Stiftung Dialogik, which was a Swiss outfit, to change from taking care of the survivors of the Holocaust to taking care of the asylum seekers. So it was a big change. And it was an imperative that was coming down from, and you can see this from how Israel has narrativized the Holocaust to justify violence. So to an extent, that was the change in 1997 that they were making. They were looking after the asylum seekers. It was a good change. And so I said to myself, they've requested me to give a speech in order to fit this change. What should I do? I cannot encourage their feeling that they are good, that they are top-down philanthropists. They're really helping these poor old... You see, so when people praise me for those schools, saying, first of all, they think I just give money. But second of all, they praise me saying, you're really helping. So what are you talking about? I'm repaying ancestral debts. We harmed them. So to an extent, the idea of helping the asylum seekers, I found I had to question it. So I thought, what the hell can I talk about? And it came to me, the thought of the planet, and I proposed, I didn't realize this then, I began to think about it, in fact, writing the speech for the Holberg Prize, that what I was really doing is I was proposing a more robust kind of secularism rather than the one that we inherit from a changeover in European history. Because remember, the seculum and the ecclesia, in the old days, it was the ecclesia that was clean. The seculum was marked by menstrual blood, by birth, by all that stuff, right? The seculum was bad, and it was the ecclesia that was clean. It was the church that was clean, right? And I very much enjoy the new pope trying to behave as if the church is clean. I think I totally support it. But after the Reformation, the seculum slowly was developed in the European narrative context as the place of the division between church and state, etc. Why should places with completely different histories inherit that one? You know, it's not correct to make religion totally private, like going to the bathroom, and the church, because it doesn't work. You will see that in all of these so-called enlightened European countries, in God we trust. You know, it's not, you can't write religion out, because if religion is working as something like the ethical, then it's there. You can't divide, and you can't make secularism just legal, because you change laws, you don't change minds. So therefore, the idea I was saying, trying to think of something to say to the Swiss so that they wouldn't just congratulate themselves, I fell into this planet thinking, because I felt there's a sentence there that this could go from all the way from animism to the white mythology of rationality. That's, I mean, I didn't realize it, but I was talking about something like a new and robust secularism. And so, but I feel that the death of a discipline, where I was talking to the US students, it was a bit of a betrayal of that thought. You know, it makes it doable. It possibilizes it. I think it was a kind of intended mistake, you know, and it's, you have to talk like that if you're teaching, I suppose, but I try not to anymore.
Was that a good mistake or a bad mistake?
Well, I think it was a bad mistake. I mean, it became, it gave just a formula of we save resources, etc., etc. It's just a do-gooding mistake. I said that one could read planetarily. I don't think so. I just read it over again because Columbia brought out a, I think, 20th anniversary edition. And I was a little undone. But there was something that someone else, like I say, you know, readers, helped me understand what I'm doing. A philosopher who teaches in the New Delhi, maybe he's retired now, New Delhi Institute of Technology, he proposed, there was a conference on my work in Pune, and he proposed a theory that he thought I was practicing of intended mistakes, you know, which I'd actually say about Hegel's phenomenology, that it always invites the reader to make the kind of mistake that it forbids in its discourse. So I think that's what it was, you know, because I was not really talking about a death. I was giving an elegy. So this time in the new foreword that I've written for the new edition, I say, and I just read it over again because I have asked the class to read it. I say, and I was very amused, let complete, because complete I'm using slang, nickname, let complete rise again and again with new relays, because I'm being honest. It's not something that talks about a death, but it actually pronounces an elegy, how to rise again. And you will rise by making that mistake of thinking you can be planetary in your reading. But now I realize that you should know that it's a mistake, that the future anterior can't be imagined so easily, because then it's not the future frontier. It truly is contingent. And so that's, and you know, I resonate with Hegel there, because we were reading Hegel, and suddenly I see that Hegel is saying the absolutely accidental. Hey, that's the contingent. So it amuses me that, you know, I relate to my own work. Etienne would say I rectify myself. So, you know, it's...
But that's a beautiful story of how like an idea comes into being, and then how it kind of lingers, and you see that it doesn't really
No, this
fit,
one was a product of thinking and thinking. And then I recognized this time that I was talking about the robust secularism. Yes, I like that story.
Thank you so much for dedicating your time to this conversation. It has been wonderful. Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, winner of the Holberg Prize 2025.
Thank you. My pleasure.